Welcome back to Passionate World Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, entertain. And this morning on Cool Your Heels with Lillian, our special guest is Rick Morez, who's from the Techno Power, and he's going to talk about possible cyber attack on the electrical grid. So good morning, Rick. How are you doing?
Good morning, Lillian, and I'm doing well, despite the challenges I think everyone has these days, but I'm doing well and hope you are and your listeners are as well.
Well, if you follow the rules and understand that this is not forever, well, some things might be forever, but the initial part of it is not forever, I think we'll be okay. And to tell you the truth, I think it's good for the United States citizens to go through this type of thing every now and then to remind them what's really important.
I think that is well said, and I think you're right. It really does bring home how important the things are that matter, family, health, and I think you're absolutely right, and I think we'll come out stronger after all this.
I think so too, which leads us to cyber attacks on the electrical grid, which lots of people really don't spend time worrying about unless they're an IT professional.
That's right, and let me say that as we just mentioned, the pandemic, I think in a way points out how important the electric grid is and how we rely on it. And right now, most people are in their homes, working from home. They're doing schoolwork from home. But when you think about it, everything that we're relying on even today, and I've thought much about this over the last several weeks. Electric power for lighting, for heating. Power continues to be provided for telecommunications, for computers at home, for the logistics industries, yes, for hospitals, and for the limited transportation, and even the logistics that provides the continuity of keeping supermarkets and the like open and running, and providing us still with a level of comfort and a standard of living that if we did have an unfortunate interruption of that electric supply, we would be in a much different place. So that's why we at Protect Our Power still are and have been advocating for the integrity of the electric grid because we rely on it so heavily.
And it's something for people really to think about. That's what separates the 20th and 21st century from the 19th century.
Indeed. When we think about it and how fortunate we are to have this interconnectivity, the comforts that we can still have in our homes and our limited workplaces, and again, whether it's the logistics of bringing food to local supermarkets, or whether it's our water and wastewater continuing to run and be clean, or for you and I to be able to talk today and still keep some semblance of our daily life is really important, and it does rely on our modern electric grid to do that.
And people need to understand that don't get too comfortable in the fact that you believe it's always going to be there, because there's no guarantee that it will always be there. Cyber attacks, they're dangerous, but a homegrown terrorist group can come in and blow up the power lines.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We've at Protect Our Power, we've spent a lot of time talking specifically about the potential of a cyber attack on the electric grid, and I'm sure you might have a few questions particularly about that, but you're absolutely right. We have been advocating for the protection of the electric grid and its upgrade and the investments in it, and it being more resilient, which is to withstand attacks as well, or threats, as well as to recover and respond to those threats. So whether it's a aging system, or whether it is a cyber attack, or whether it's a natural event like a storm, or an intentional act, as you just mentioned, from someone who wants to cause physical damage to the critical components, we are continue to call on policymakers, regulators in the industry to do everything they can to support those investments and those upgrades that are necessary to keep the electric system resilient and up and running.
So when you start watching those late night thrillers, or even Jessica Fletcher in Murder, She Wrote, once they cut those phone lines, you're all in the dark.
That's right. We don't, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we don't always think about that, but today we rely on the powering of our communication systems, our televisions, our computers, whether it's a cell phone, an iPad, a desktop, or whether it's any other communication system. And those communication systems keep us not only talking to each other like this and broadcasting to all your listeners, but also for students, for online learning, as well as for keeping pumps running in the local water system, or keeping the ATMs running and ensuring continuity of our financial system. So all those things are important. They're interrelated, and we need to make sure that the power is there to keep all those systems running.
And it's something that you need to understand just exactly how the grid is set up. Now, a lot of people ask me, okay, Lillian, how many grids do we have? Is there any major grids, and do they need to take out all of them, or would one central intelligent grid be what would be controlling all the other grids?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's several grids actually, and I'd like to remind people that essentially there are two separate ones. One is the traditional bulk power system, where there's a large power plant generating electricity that then goes out to transmission lines, oftentimes across states. And then there's the referred to as the step down to the distribution system, and that's from those transmission lines to larger stations that then bring it into your home or to an office or to a business. And there's a couple of things that go on there. A lot of what is in that bulk power system on that generation side is now increasingly technical and even digitized with digitized equipment, as is what's happening on that distribution side. Everything that comes to a home or a business, smart meters, smart thermostats, more and more what's referred to as distributed energy resources, small on-site generation, the emergence now of batteries in structures. So more and more of all of those systems, either on the bulk power side or at the distribution side, all the way down to your home, has more and more electronics in it, more and more digitized equipment. And part of the concern that we have, and one that we've spent time focusing on, is that in the integrity of all that equipment and whether that digitized equipment, those electronics, can be hacked by bad people.
And not only just being hacked by bad people, but you also have to understand that, for example, in Michigan, people steal the copper off of the wires because copper is such a scarce resource now.
Right. Yeah, and so you asked the question of whether there's one place where there could be a point of failure. There can often be, whether it's from storms or whether it's from an intentional act of somebody stealing those components, or as has happened, terrorists who've tried to shoot up, literally to fire ammunition and to disrupt that equipment, or a electronic cyber hack. All those threats are in fact real. They are a potential, and those are the kinds of issues across the board that we've been calling for continued action by the industry, regulators, and policymakers to make those investments to keep the equipment and those different components safe.
So what kind of education would today's student need to have in order to become more involved with the newer digital grid?
Right. Well, I think that's happening. People know more and more about what's being introduced onto the grid, whether it's solar panels or whether it is a smart thermostat in your home. And a student or any homeowner actually should be thinking about all those kind of components. Some of them help reduce their costs and obviously provide the opportunity for, particularly with renewable energy, the opportunity for generation and electric service with reduced emissions. However, those new technologies, because they include electronic components, two-way power flow, which we've never had before, where, for example, power is being generated from a solar panel back onto the grid. All are good things, but they then open up these additional potential threats like we've never seen before. So anyone and any student needs to now be mindful that with this new smarter grid, it's in fact smarter, but it's smarter because we rely on those electronic components, and they need to be thinking about how to protect it. And a homeowner needs to do that and make sure that if they install equipment, that whoever does that ensures that they have the firewalls from a computer standpoint or other safeguards in place to make sure that those electronics aren't going to be hacked or that they're going to fail.
And it's something that you need to understand. Now, I have a 6-year-old grandson,
Mm-hmm.
and he's fascinated with batteries and electrical things. And he goes on Discover and looks at all how you make stuff with the electrical thing and with batteries. And he's just fascinated by it. He spends hours watching it. And which I think is great, because in the world he's going to go into, I would suspect it will become even more complicated with artificial intelligence calling the shots of how the grid is protected and set up in such a way that people don't have free access to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, your grandson sounds like a really smart fellow, and we need more of young students like him to be exploring these opportunities. But you're right. Artificial intelligence and the reliance on the electronics, in one way, is as good as the systems and the people that make them. They, however, over-reliance on those electronic systems, that artificial intelligence, without really making sure that it works, could be a point of failure unto itself. There are efforts in the electric industry coming from the large electric companies, where they've actually asked the manufacturers of electronic components to provide a fail-safe. They've asked for what they refer to, interestingly enough, as a spare tire strategy, or SOS, supplemental operating system, so that if the electronic systems fail, the electric companies can resort to manual operations. And in fact, that's exactly what happened in a much publicized hack of the Ukrainian electric system several years ago, 3-4 years ago. The system was hacked, was taken over by others, and those Ukrainian electric operators, because they still had largely in place manual operating systems, were able to revert to them and disconnect from the electronics and continued then to operate the system safely. Otherwise, the reports are that Ukrainian electric system would have been overtaken by the hackers and controlled completely and remotely by others. So that's the dynamic that can unfold, and why even young people, as they learn about this, need to be mindful of how the electronics can be a real benefit to us, but also we need to be careful to make sure that they are secure.
So that would be the same kind of scenery that they would need to have for the military intelligence to keep people out.
That's right. And in fact, there are emerging efforts, at least in the U.S. Military and out of the Pentagon, to do exactly that, to have a new set of standards for all of the systems, the computer systems and equipment that is integrated into military operations, operations, whether it's into a fighter jet or whether it's into a combat vehicle or a ship. There are new referred to as maturity models, which are now being required of all of the suppliers of every piece of equipment or a component that goes into one of those combat or military vehicles or vessel or missile system, all the way down to the provider of the smallest component. And that's a supply chain risk or oversight that is really now becoming much a focus. That's what the Pentagon's doing. But we at Protect Our Power have been working with Governor Tom Ridge, former Homeland Security Director, who has authored with us a review of supply chain issues and challenges, and how coming back to the electric sector, how the electric sector can provide better security to all the components in the supply chain, and some better practices that can be employed in receiving that equipment for the manufacturers, for the buyers and sellers of that equipment. And that's something we're proud of to be able to highlight as something that really needs to be a best practice in the electric system, is to making sure that supply chain is now also secure.
And that's something for the kids who are coming up through the ranks to remember, that there are going to be jobs for people within the electrical industry that will not go to robots or to computers who do the thinking for you, because you're asking for a disaster to happen, so that you're always going to have man in charge.
Yeah. You raise a really good point, and it's something that I think younger people don't always think about, is looking forward and ahead to where the need for good jobs is. And on this issue of having a trained workforce around the issues of components of electronics, around cybersecurity professionals, is really a big discussion right now. I've seen some statistics from both from various industries, as well as from the firms that track this information, that are the placement firms for jobs, and they're suggesting that over the next several years there will be, on average, on a monthly basis, probably a need for tens of thousands of additional jobs needed on cybersecurity alone. With the increase in electronics and components, as we've just mentioned, there are going to be the need for more and more professionals to do that, to secure those systems, to analyze them, and to manage them. That's an area where young people really should be looking at, because there is certainly going to be a big demand. Many schools, though they're right now at the moment working remotely, and maybe proving out the fact that there is that reliance on the electronic medium, there's going to be more and more of a need for that. And just on this issue of cybersecurity itself, in different industries like the electric sector, there are even now, because of that shortage of the resources, the people to do this work, that there are agreements in place, for example, for the utility companies, that if there is a intrusion, one that actually happens, there are what are referred to as mutual assistance agreements between companies, so that if a company has a hack and they have need to rebuild their IT systems and to recover from that attack, they can call upon the staff of other companies that have signed those mutual assistance agreements, and that company that has been hacked, they can get the resources from others to come and help them rebuild. So those mutual assistance agreements are becoming prevalent in various industries on the cybersecurity staffing level. So that's something that the people should keep in mind. I think that young people, as they're looking for good careers, should know that those jobs are there. They're going to be out there, and there's going to be more and more opportunity and a need for those skilled jobs.
Especially if you're bilingual.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you speak Spanish at home, continue speaking it.
Right. No, absolutely. Both. We're in a global economy, and you've got coders here in the United States, but coders and folks working on these issues all over the world, and it is a global workforce, and we have to continue to make sure that we're conversant with in various languages to make sure that we can continue to man those efforts.
Absolutely. So it's something for you to think about. My son took Chinese when he was in high school, and while he can't speak it fluently, because apparently one word means over 300 additional words, they all mean the same thing, depending how you put the accent and pronounce it. So I can imagine it gets pretty freaky. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is he can understand it if it's written. Mm-hmm. And folks, that is just an avenue to give you into other people's grids, which we have to understand,
right,
in order to protect ourselves from them.
That's right. No, we do. I talk about these issues regularly with people, and as I mentioned before, we at Protect Our Power focus on intentional threats. We focus on how storms or cyber attacks could be a potential, but we also when we talk to businesses or to regulators or policymakers, we also say that they need to be thinking about these kinds of threats across their entire enterprise. The corporate folks or boards of directors will refer to this as enterprise risk management. And you need to look at, and I think everybody needs to think about these things, sort of how do threats potentially affect their entire business operation, or even in a household, how they affect their household operations. So people need to think about enterprise-wide how any one threat could adversely affect their day-to-day operations, their business, or their livelihood. And what you just raised is equally as much part of that, is to think about this broadly and globally about how we move forward to look at how different issues affect us every day and how any one might affect us across the board.
Absolutely. That long cable that they have underneath the Atlantic Ocean that reaches to the other shore, that needs electricity, folks.
Absolutely.
And all those offshore oil rigs, they need the power in order to do their job. So there is a plethora of jobs associated with the electrical industry. And it's always going to be around because that is the foundation upon which our civilization is built upon.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, our reliance on electricity is definitely a paramount, and that nexus to all those other critical services is really important for people to think about. And we're going to have more and more of it as we see the expansion of the use of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles not just for consumers, but for fleets, for whether they be bus or rail or the logistics industry, for example. Companies are increasingly using trucks for freight. We're going to see more and more of that. And then there's the continued push for electrification of appliances, and whether it be in residences or commercial structures. So the demand for electricity, not just to continue to support our existing infrastructure, but other infrastructure and the expansion of it, it really continues to be important, and people to really be thinking about how important it is and how we need to make those investments to make sure that it is secure and delivered safely.
And so would you just recommend kids go to technical school, or should they go to college and get an understanding of what they're doing and learn how to solve some of the problems that will come along with the electrical grid?
Well, that's certainly up to the to that student and to that student's family. I do think that oftentimes there's an statement or over focus on students going to colleges and not looking at the technical professions. I think we've in some way kind of lost that in this country.
Yes, we have. That's why we have a shortage.
Yeah, exactly. There are good jobs, just as we mentioned before. There are in electronics and cyber or other fields where you really don't need a college degree. There are schools that provide that training and really, really good, and by the way, good paying jobs. College isn't for everybody, and we need to be honest about that. If a student really wants to go and get a college education, they should, and pursue what interests them and what they're good at. But if somebody's not sure and they're want to get a job and want to be able to do something worthwhile, they're out there, and there is a need, as you just mentioned. There's certainly a need for those technical jobs, which people should really look hard at, and they can be good paying jobs, and they can have a good career.
Are there any intern positions where kids maybe from high school or even from college can take a look and maybe decide this is something more that they want to do than going to a 4-year school?
Yeah, there are those kinds of programs out there, and they're available. Just to get a sense of what they are. And by the way, lots of schools, including the high schools these days, even have those partnerships with the likes of the local community colleges or state colleges throughout the country on various careers like these. So the opportunity is there, and those students should explore them all and see what interests them, but also what they're good at, and that can help them define what their pathway is to a career.
Terrific. Rick, can you please tell everybody where they can find you and your company on the World Wide Web? Any contact information, anything else they need to know in order to get, summer's coming,
yeah,
and the country's beginning to open up?
Yeah. We at Protect Our Power, which by the way is a nonprofit advocacy organization for protecting the electric grid, is at www.protectourpower, all one word, .org. We have a blog which I just wrote this week on some of the issues we touched on today. We have other articles. We have materials about our work with Governor Tom Ridge and supply chain, and some videos, and also just timely information that people should take a look at to see the kinds of work we're doing to continue to advocate for the investments and for the security of the electric grid, which is so important to all of us.
Absolutely, especially in this new technological world. But there's nothing wrong with getting your hands dirty either. Just look at the kids playing outside in the mud.
Yeah, and go and enjoy it, too.
And go and enjoy it, absolutely. And ladies, there's nothing to prevent you from seeking a career in the electrical industry either. During the 50s and 60s, it was unheard of.
That's right.
But it's not the 50s and 60s anymore. It's not the grandma generation anymore. So go and seek out, if you feel this is what you want, you go and take a look at it.
Absolutely. I have, by the way, 3 children. I have two daughters, and I tell them all the time, do what you really want to do, what interests you, and you'll be better for it. And that's true of anybody. There's lots of good careers out there, and they should pursue it and do what they like and look for a good future.
Terrific. Well, ladies and gentlemen, and adults of all ages, if you want to hear this interview all over again, you can go over to https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. Scroll down the right-hand side where you'll find the menu, find Cool Your Heels, click on it. Or if you're digitally challenged or don't believe in electricity at all, you can use your telephone. And we have a sizzle line, which is a phone line. Put in the number and you'll start hearing the recording immediately. Or you can hear it on iHeart, iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and all the other podcast directories that are out there. And before you guys go away, Lucian had this to say in 115 to 180 BC. For mortals, mortal things, and all things leave us, or if they do not, then we leave them. Thank you all very much for listening, and until next time, remember, wear that mask. Have a great day.